Hello, hello, hello. This is Chris Ferdinandi from GoMakeThings.com. And today I wanted to do something a little bit different. And rather than live build a thing, I wanted to show you a thing I already built that's pretty complex that would have taken more than a live coding session. But it is the Code Sandbox that I use over at theleanwebclub.com as a way to demo different tools and let my students try different things that they're learning before they go and try to like work it into a project. So it's a little bit of micro learning along the way. So it's a really cool tool that I built for just running some HTML, CSS, and JavaScript live in the browser. There's no third-party services needed. There's no backend to it. So you can't do NPM builds or anything that requires a build step. It doesn't do that. I know some more robust tools do that, but it's free. And it's really lightweight and it runs pretty much anywhere, which is really cool. So I will drop a link to the source code down in the description, but the most updated, I'm going to actually keep up with it and, publish changes as I make them version will live exclusively over at theleanwebclub.com. So if you want ongoing access to that, you can sign up for free. My Cyber Monday sale actually is still going on this week. So if you wanted to join for 50% off for a whole year, now is the time to do that. And you actually get like a month-long free trial before then. So you can check that out over at leanwebclub.com. But enough about the ranting. Let's dive into it. We're going to look at how it works, and then we'll look under the hood to learn how it works. Yeah, cool. So here is a demo, right? So this is actually inside the Lean Web Club. I've got a toolkit with a ton of different stuff. And one of those is a web component library with like web components I have made that I actually use on client projects and for my own work. And one of those is the Code Sandbox. So if you jump in here, one of the things you'll notice is you can type, and it actually syntax highlights live as you type, which is really fun. If you pause for a second or three, it will render some content into the UI, so it live updates, right? So how are you today? Right. You can also like tab in. So, you don't have to space. You just do whatever. You do have the ability to run JavaScript, and I've even got like a console log UI here. The nice thing about this one is it also supports warn and error. So you get some different colors. You can see we've got yellow and we've got red. I can clear the console out if I need to do that. I don't want this to keep running, so I'm just going to wipe that out for now. And it also supports CSS. So for example, if I wanted to style my heading here with maybe a different color and maybe a different size, right? So we're going to go 1.2 rem, something like that. You can see it's a little smaller now, and it's got a color to it. And every time I make changes, they just live update in the UI. I can also reload to just reset the thing to, say, factory settings if you want. And so I use this throughout the Lean Web Club. Here's an example, for example, of how to use the array prototype map method. And when you're done, I actually give you a challenge, right? So create a new array with just wizard names. And the version we were just looking at renders like an HTML preview, but there's no HTML here. This is just JavaScript. So I can actually set the console to be the thing that displays. And in the Lean Web Club, I've got a challenge for you, which you can work on in real time. And then I've got a little how I approached it, where I show you my solution. And you can see it renders out now my new streamlined array, nicely formatted into the console, which is always a nice thing. And yeah, we've got the HTML versions too. So as you just saw, so HTML, CSS, the whole shebang, really nice. Let's take a quick look at how you can actually use it, because it's got a bunch of different features. So the version we were just looking at was the styled for my theme kind of setup. So if you notice, my code sections all have this darker blue and this kind of custom Monokai-esque variant that I'm using in all of my stuff. It's It's basically Monokai, but with a slightly more nautical theme to it. Instead of the dark grays and charcoals, I switched it over to a little bit more blue because I like blue. For the open source version, I've gone with a more neutral palette. That way you can customize it to your own needs a bit more easily. So with that in mind, let's dive right in. One thing I do need to call out right out of the gate, this uses ES modules to load the syntax highlighting script. So I do need to have a local server running to be able to demo this to you. I can't just open the file, but it doesn't need the web per se. It just needs a website. So it doesn't have to be connected to the internet, but it does need a web server. So if I jump into the browser, this is the most kind of bare bones basic version here. And so the way it works is you've got your Code Sandbox custom element here. And I add the hidden attribute to all of these. That way, if for some reason the JavaScript doesn't load or hasn't loaded yet, users aren't seeing a bunch of gibberish that they can't actually do anything with. So when the web component loads, it's going to remove this to make everything visible, but until it does, it's all hidden. I include text areas for my HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And this is going to be any one of those that I want rendered into the UI. I can include starting code, or I could just leave them completely empty, or not use them at all. So you don't need to include all three. You can have just one, just two, whatever you want. The nice thing about using a text area, like when I originally went down this path, I was looking at just like divs or something, but with a text area, all the spacing is preserved. So if I had an initial render here that included some multi-line HTML or CSS or JavaScript, all of those line breaks get preserved. And then the thing that the user is going to be editing, it's there already anyway. So it works out really, really nicely. And so the thing with that is each one of these gets an attribute of 4 and the value equal to the thing that it's for. Is it the HTML, the CSS, or the JavaScript? And as long as you have those, you're golden. A couple of other attributes worth calling out. By default, each of these will get rendered into a collapsed section. If you want one open by default, you slap the open attribute on it. Otherwise, they're all collapsed. So if I jump over, you can see HTML and CSS are collapsed. JavaScript is the one that's expanded, but I can also toggle these open as kind of accordion areas, disclosures. These use details and summary under the hood. Similarly, displaying a console where stuff gets logged out is optional. If I want that to be shown, I can add the console attribute. If I don't, I can remove it. So if I take this away and reload, you can see the console goes away. And now the button to clear the console also goes away because it's no longer needed. And finally, I've got a div here with 4 equals intro. If you have any content that you want rendered in conjunction with this Code Sandbox, but you don't want it to display until the sandbox is ready, you can pop it in there and it will automatically get displayed once this shows up. So it could be like a heading or a description of what the sandbox does. If you wanted the result to be the console instead of an iframe, you set result equals console, and that's what shows up. And similarly, I also have the ability, you'll notice in here, I've got this whole how I approach this kind of thing. That's built right in as well. So if you add the collapse attribute, the sandbox will be hidden behind a details element. And if you add a summary to the intro, you get your toggle as well. So this, this try it out text right here is driven by that, that summary inside the intro div. So that's really it in a nutshell. You can see here I've got some kind of default stuff. This console log of hi, and yeah, it all works out really, really nicely, I've found. So the color on that probably needs to get updated for the worn for the lighter background, but I will address that after the video. Yeah, so that's really honestly just the basics of how this all how this all works from a functional front end UI perspective. We talked about the console. We talked about the intro text and the expansion. I guess the two last things that are worth mentioning. So syntax highlighting on this is driven by Prism.js. So let me actually pull that up. Prism.js. Here we go. Okay, so Prism is this really awesome JavaScript-based syntax highlighter by Leah Veru. And that is built right into the Code Sandbox web component. The reason we need to load this as an ES module with type equals module is specifically because I am importing that Prism script. I did make a small modification to the downloaded version to set Prism to manual mode. So I'd recommend using the downloaded version or moving this manual mode toggle into the Code Sandbox JS, I guess, if you want. But I think from what I read, this has to be declared before Prism is loaded, which is why I'm handling it the way I am in here. And what this does is by setting it in manual mode, Prism won't run automatically on the whole page, and then we can run it dynamically every time the user types to update the code as they're typing it. And it's also extremely stylable. So as you'll see in here, there is a whole bunch of CSS to control the layout, to give you this this 2-column grid on desktop. And then if you move into smaller viewport sizes, so if I shrink this down, you can see it jumps into more of a single column with the result displayed, or the console, as the case may be, displayed below. And that's basically it. If we were to look at this, the most important thing to note, like you can do whatever you want with the CSS, but the one really important thing, the way that drives how all of this works is, that's not the part I wanted to expand. Well, actually, that's probably good to have that expanded too. But if I jump in here, so this is where most of the styling, the syntax highlighting magic happens. So we've got the sandbox mirror and the sandbox text, and they are positioned directly on top of each other. So the pre-element is behind, and the text area that the user actually types in is ahead. These are styled to look exactly the same. So they have the same border radius, the same padding, the same font size, the same typeface, same margin. They are identical with one exception. The text area is set to have a background color and text color of transparent. And so when you type in here, what is actually happening is the text in here gets mirrored into the pre that is behind it. And then that pre element gets syntax highlighted by Prism. And because the text area is transparent, you're actually seeing the text behind it showing through. Every time I tried to do this a different way, it would end up overwriting stuff as the user was typing and messing up kind of focus and cursor position. And so in this way, I can highlight everything and copy it, and it all to the end user looks absolutely seamless. But I'm not actually highlighting the syntax highlighted stuff. I'm highlighting the text area content, which is taking up the exact same amount of space because I've styled it to otherwise look identical. And that's true for the CSS and the HTML as well. It all works exactly the same. So any changes you make here, if you decide to, move things around and make it look more like your theme or your layout, just make sure you preserve kind of that matched styling there. Inside codesandbox.css, I have all of the Prism styles to go with this. They have been prefixed or scoped to the sandbox mirror element, but Please feel free to remove that if you want them to apply globally. Feel free to update them to a different Prism theme if you're so inclined. I just went with the generic out-of-the-box one for ease. It looks pretty good, but you are more than welcome to change it however you see fit. Yeah. With that out of the way, I guess let's dive into how this all actually works under the hood, because we've seen the styling and you've gotten a look for like the HTML, but how does this actually work from a JavaScript level? I'm going to take a drink of water because I've been rambling for a little while. But while I'm doing that, take a minute and leave a comment if you like this video or you have any questions. Give it a thumbs up or subscribe, share it with a friend. All of these things let YouTube know that you like it, and they help grow this channel so more people can learn from this kind of stuff. So while you're doing that, I'm going to take a drink of water. All right, cool. So I am, as is normal for any sort of web component, I am defining my code sandbox, and I'm passing in a class that extends the HTML element. And then in my constructor, I am running the super method to make sure I get access to all of the parent properties on the HTML element class. And then I am getting a bunch of things from inside the existing HTML. So we've got this setup version here. I am grabbing the for intro elements, the for HTML, for CSS, and for JavaScript element. And I'm also checking to see if it has the collapse attribute and should be collapsed by default instead of expanded. I'm also defining some properties. So I want the ability to add unique IDs to each of these. And so I'm using the crypto random UUID method, which generates a cryptographically unique identifier. And this just ensures that the ID is pretty random and shouldn't collide with anything else on the page. And then I'm also setting some defaults because you know how we have in the script here the ability to reload or like reset. So if I were to, right now I've got let name equals Chris, I can reload that and it's going to reset it back to the original version. So the way I do that is by basically storing those original defaults so that we can go back to them. And I'm using ternary operators here. So if there's an HTML element, I'm going to get its value and save it to this HTML property. Otherwise, I give it a value of false. I do that for CSS and JavaScript. If it should have a console visible, I'm making note of that by looking for the console attribute. This returns a Boolean. So if it has the attribute, it's true. If it doesn't, it's false. And then I'm checking to see what the displayed result should be. So by default, it's going to be the iFrame. But if result is there as an attribute and it equals console, I'm going to show the console instead. And then finally, I'm doing some debouncing. So as the user types, I don't want to immediately re-render the iPhone or the iFrame, not the iPhone, the iFrame in real time as they type, because that would be really bad for performance. So I am waiting a beat until they stop typing, and then I go and render that iframe. So we're batching a bunch of changes into a single render. Once I've gathered all my properties and defined all the different values, I actually render the sandbox HTML into the UI. So we've got our text areas. Those are already there, but we need to put a whole bunch of stuff around them. So I am creating my logger element. I'm doing this ahead of time because depending on your settings, it might show up in different places. And you notice for each of these, there's an ID that usually starts with sandbox dash and then some specifics about the element and then the UUID. And it also gets a class, so you can target them generically if you'd like as well. And then I'm setting the inner HTML of my code sandbox. If it should be collapsed and there's an intro, I am going to add the details element. It's important to have that intro because we need it as the kind of the summary to expand or collapse. If there's an intro, I am getting its content and displaying it. And then I'm creating the actual sandbox itself. So we've got the header with our buttons. You can see I'm checking if there's a console or there's not, but the result should be console. I'm going to display a button to clear the console. I've got some classes in here that are probably unique to my design system and could come out. They're just in there now because this code probably needs a little bit of cleanup. I'll make sure I do that before I post this down into the description. And then we've got the actual sandbox content. So this is the editor and either the iFrame or the console if you've defined that. So for each of the different editors, I have a special method I'm using to actually generate the editor, create the pre-element, drop the text editor on top of it, and the default content so that we have it. Yeah, and I'm sorry, not actually the default content, the existing text area. So not the content inside it. So I'm passing that, and then the type of content it should be, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And then finally, I've got my rendered output. So if it should be an iframe, I'm going to give it sandbox result. If it should be the console, I'm going to give it the console result class. These just allow us to style those two things a little bit differently. I am always going to create the iframe, even if I'm rendering in the console here, because I need the iframe to run to get the stuff that shows up in the console. If the result should be just the console, I'm going to hide the iframe, but it's still going to be there actually running the code. Again, if the result should be the console, I drop in my logger. If the console is defined and the result is in console, because we don't really want them to show up twice, I am also going to add the logger down at the bottom, as we saw in a little bit of the UI. So you've got this version with it down here, and then you've got the other version where it's kind of like the main piece of content. And then again, if it should be collapsed, we're just going to close off that details element. Once I have this rendered into the UI, I want to get some of the new elements that didn't exist before so that we can continue to work with them in the rest of our script. So I'm going to get the rendered HTML, CSS, and JavaScript elements. These are the things that are created by the create editor method. I'm also going to get the iframe itself and the console log UI, which I'm calling the logger element here. The render method is going to render some initial UI into the iframe, and then down the road, it also makes some changes or updates. And then I'm listening for a bunch of different events. I need to detect input events, so whenever one of those text areas is changed, key down events so that I can detect the tab key and automatically indent my code, and then click events to handle clicking the reload and clear console buttons, respectively. And then finally, once all of that setup is done, I can remove the hidden attribute to actually make this thing visible. One quick note on the event listeners, I'm passing in this, which is the web component class. I've talked about this before, but this is one of my favorite things about web components. So rather than passing in a function, you can pass in an object to add event listener. And if that object has a handle event method on it, that method will automatically run whenever the event listener fires and automatically receive the event object. And the really nice thing about doing it that way is that the method remains in its normal context. So it has access to this, the class, and all of the properties and instances, instance methods rather, on it. So I don't have to do all sorts of weird stuff with like bind and arrow functions to maintain that connection. And then I've got this one set up to automatically run different on events depending on the event type. So on input, on key down, on click, it's going to run my on input, on click, on key down kind of methods. And we'll look at what those do in a couple minutes. The other thing I wanted to I kind of wanted to focus on first is, where is it? So this part here, the create editor methods. So we've got the type and then the actual text area element. So what I'm doing in this method, I'm creating a details element. If the text area has the open attribute, we're going to set that details element to be open by default. If not, it's just closed. We're going to create a summary that's got the type as uppercase. So again, HTML, CSS, or JS. We're giving it a label. This one has a class of screen reader on it. So the label is hidden, but it gives the text area a label. So someone who's using a screen reader knows what's actually happening here. And then we're generating that editor wrapper with the pre-element that shows the mirrored text as the user types and the text area itself. One thing you'll notice here is that I'm actually not just dropping the text area that was already there in place. I'm creating a new one with some additional attributes on it. So no spell check, no autocorrect, no auto capitalization. Because this is going to be code, all of those things can really mess up your ability to write code. They can change things on you, which gets really annoying when you're just trying to type. And then when the render method runs, if there's an HTML element, it's going to update that value and then mirror the content. Same thing for CSS and JavaScript. So the reason I'm not rendering content here is because I do it once all those elements have been created and injected into the UI. So I'm going to render them, and then I run the update iFrame method. And what that does is it clones the existing iFrame, replaces it with the copy that we just created, and then I have a iFrame element property on the instance, and I assign the clone to it. That way we have access to it and we can work with and manipulate it. I'll look at this in a minute. Setup console. This is how we handle console log and actually showing that stuff in a UI. It was really annoying to figure out. And then finally, I actually render the iframe. So to do that, this part honestly just came from Stack Overflow. I did a bunch of Googling. I tried a bunch of things. This was the approach that worked the best. So I'm using the iframe element, content window, document write line method. And then I'm adding, if there's an HTML element, we're getting its value, we're dropping it in. Same thing with CSS and JavaScript. I am setting all of my JavaScript script elements to use type equals module. That way, if the user wanted to import something as an ES module, they have the ability to do so. And if they don't, it just runs as normal anyways. So no harm, no foul. And yeah, so that renders everything in. You'll also notice that we've got this mirror content method. So every time I am rendering, updating the text area value, I'm also mirroring the content. This is where the Prism.js syntax highlighting stuff happens. So I get my element, my text area. Then I grab the previous element sibling. So if you've got the text area, the previous element sibling is that pre-element. And then I want its first element child, which would be the code element inside it. I'm going to set the text content of that element to my text area's value. The reason I use text content and not inner HTML is that this is going to preserve all of those line breaks and make it look the way it should, all of the spacing, everything like that. And then I pass the element into the Prism highlight element method. This is what happens when you use Prism in manual mode. I now tell Prism, okay, go ahead and highlight this thing. And it does. And that updates the syntax highlighting in that element while the user types. Let's see, a couple of other things worth taking a look at. We'll get to the console in a minute. That one is crazy annoying. The events. So on input, I am, we'll come back up to this actually. I am setting the mirror content, I'm running the mirror content method and passing my event target, the text area that triggered this input change into it. That's going to update the content in the pre-element with syntax highlighting. So it does that in real time as the user types. And then I'm using the set timeout method to run the update iFrame method. And I'm doing that, I'm setting that to run a second after the input change happens. The set timeout method returns a unique ID, and I'm assigning that to my debounce property. When this method runs, if there's an existing debounce property, I'm going to clear the timeout, which means this method will never run. So as the user types in real time, it's going to get the kind of the message to update the iframe in real time as it happens. But as long as the user keeps typing and doesn't pause for a second or more, that render update never happens. It runs finally after the user stops typing for at least 1 second, and then it will run the update in real time. You could set this for longer if you want a little bit more lag, not as much quick refreshing. I've noticed places like CodePen tend to take a little bit longer before they do their UI updates. But that's how this works without just constantly rendering fresh iframes. For my onClick methods, I am looking for the data click attribute because that tells me which type of task to run. And I will show you what that looks like here. So we've got where to go. Data click equals reset to reload the UI, or data click equals clear to clear the console. So down here, if there's a console, I'm always going to clear that out. And then if the task equals reset, I'm also going to render a new iframe. So in both of those situations, the console needs to get cleared out, which is why I always run it. But I only need to render a new iframe if the reset button was the one that was specifically clicked. And then finally on key down, this is where the tab key takes place. So first I want to make sure that the event was triggered inside one of my text areas and that it's part of this specific web component. If not, we can bail. Next, I also want to make sure that the tab key was pressed and that it wasn't the escape key. I'm sorry. I want to make sure it was the tab key or the escape key. I'll talk about that more in a second. If it was the tab key, I'm going to literally add a tab inside there using the set range text method. And then I'm going to return to end the function. If it was the escape key, I am going to shift my focus back up. So just as an example, the reason I do this is if you're someone who navigates the web entirely with a keyboard and not a mouse, normally you would tab from this text area to the next one. But once I've trapped focus and hijacked that tab key, you no longer have a way to do that. So what you can instead do is hit the escape key, and that brings your focus back up, and then you can tab out as normal. So we will escape back out of here, and then it gives you the ability to move around to other elements. Finally, the last part, honestly, the toughest part was handling the console. So I've got two methods for this. One of them is to set up the console, and then the other one is to actually parse the logging as it happens. So inside the setup console method, I'm only going to run this if there's a console defined. So if the Code Sandbox doesn't have any console or the result isn't the console, I'm not going to do anything. So one of those two situations has to be true. Next, I need to, and I tried this a million different ways. The only way I found that actually works is you have to override the console functions inside the iframe itself. So I need to redefine console log, console warm, console error, etc. And so to do that, I am setting up a temporary console variable, and then I'm going to assign, I've got this, basically I'm creating an object, and then I'm taking all of the existing console methods from the window console object, and merging them into this new object. And then I'm setting up a listener function. And for each property inside the console object, I'm going to define a new console function that runs the old. So basically, I'm cloning the native console object so that it continues to work. But I'm also setting up a listener function that I want to run. I'm defining the source as my iFrame, the message as whatever sort of information came in from the console event itself, and then the type that it was. Is it warn? Is it log? Is it error? Etc. And then I'm running it. So this gets kind of messy. So then I can, and this is actually like, it's broadcasting a message. So inside my instance, I am going to listen for those console events. And when they happen, I'm going to create a new div. I'm going to give it a log class with whatever type it was, log, error, warning, etc. I'm going to add some text content to it that is, it's going to be the logged cost. This is a helper function that we're using to make it look pretty. But basically, I'm taking the text that I got out of the event. I'm going to render it, and then I append that into the console area, whether it's the main display or down here. And then finally, if we look at the parse log, all this is really doing is handling differences between a string that was logged and arrays and objects. So if we had an object or an array, I want to loop through each item using the array map method or object entries to convert the object into an array and then loop through it with map. And I am going to display key : value, or if it's an array, just the value. I'm doing some I don't want to call it wonky math here, but basically the idea is I want to figure out how deep into this tree we are so that I can indent it appropriately. One of the things you may have noticed here is if we look at my version, this is indented, right? So it's not just all one thing. And this becomes really important as we start to get into objects. So, just as an example, if we jump into, look at something like object entries, this one doesn't have, where does this one, I haven't gotten to this yet. That's why I'm still adding. So let's jump over into immutability, actually. Yeah, here we go. So, as you start to get into the more nested arrays and objects, you're going to want, that to look better. And so that's why we do all that. So with this one, I'm adding some indents. You can see I've got my square brackets for objects, or curly brackets for objects, square brackets for arrays. One other thing we're doing is for the property itself, I am passing it into parse log. That way, if the array or the object has an array or object nested in it, we repeat this process all over again. I increase the depth by 1 each time I do that so that we indent increasingly deep as we go. And if it's not an array or an object, we just render out the string as is, with one exception. If it happens to be a node type of 1, so an element, we're going to get the tag name, div, p, a, whatever the element happens to be, strong, article. And then if there's an ID on the element, we're going to display that as well, much like how Chrome and Firefox display elements when they get logged in the console. That way you just have a sense of what it is. I do the same thing with classes. So if there's a class name, I'll display all the classes, and that makes it easier for you to kind of pinpoint which element got logged. So with all that out of the way, it's actually not an overly complicated web component. You look at the whole thing is less than 300 lines with generous comments and spacing, but it was a lot to figure out. The whole thing weighs in at 9 kilobytes plus the 52 for Prism. So Prism is much, much larger, unminified. Once you minify it and gzip it, this all gets a lot smaller. But yeah, I'm going to drop this up on GitHub. I'll drop that down in the description. If you enjoyed this, please like, share, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. Also, don't forget to check out the Lean Web Club, where you can dig into more web components like this, actually download updated versions of this and keep up with its progress. And it'll also get you access to my private Discord, where you can interact with other people who are also on their code learning journey, ask questions, talk to me directly about some of the stuff I've done and why, and tell me how wrong I am, or share ideas. Yeah, and right now that is on sale. So I'm still running my Cyber Monday sale until the end of the week. So you can get 50% off for an entire year after a 30-day free trial to see if you like it. So head over to leanwebclub.com to check that out, and I will see you next week. Cheers.